The warehouse floor was slick with condensation, and every crate Leo moved felt heavier than the last. By the end of his 10-hour shift, his shoulders burned with a dull, rhythmic ache that pulsed in time with the factory lights. He clocked out, walked home through the gray streets, and entered his room. It was small, barely enough space for a bed and a desk, but the wall held the only thing that mattered. A jagged piece of parchment, stained with coffee and age, was pinned to the plaster. Leo stood before it, his fingers tracing the ink-stained route toward the whispering peaks. He knew every twist of the path by heart. In the silence of his room, the map seemed to vibrate with a life his warehouse job could never provide. He grabbed a pencil and pressed it against the paper, marking a new waypoint near the base of the ascent. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The routine of his life felt like a cage, and for the first time, he stopped looking at the map as a fantasy. He started looking at it as a map of his escape. Leo pulled his rucksack from under the bed and began filling it. He moved with purpose, folding gear and checking supplies. The floorboards creaked behind him. He did not turn, but he knew the rhythm of those footsteps. His father stood in the doorway. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of years of expectations. His father stepped forward, his hands slamming down. He gripped the edge of the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. The skin stretched tight over bone. "Be realistic," his father said. "You have a pension plan. You have a steady paycheck. Do not throw your life away for a ghost story." Leo stopped packing. He looked at the rucksack, then at the man who had spent his entire life building a perimeter of safety. The argument hung in the air. Leo did not raise his voice. He did not offer a rebuttal or a defense. He simply finished closing the bag. He set the bag by the door and walked past his father, the decision already etched into his stride. The house was silent the next morning. No floorboards creaked. No voices argued over the breakfast table. Leo stood in the kitchen, the air still holding the cold remnants of the night. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his ring of keys, and set them on the granite counter. The metal clinked against the stone, a sharp, final sound that echoed through the empty hallway. He did not look back at the rooms he had known his entire life. He grabbed his rucksack, the weight of it settling against his spine, and pushed the front door open. Outside, the world had vanished. A thick, gray fog pressed against the porch, swallowing the street and the familiar path to the warehouse. He stepped off the threshold and into the damp, swirling mist. The ground beneath his boots felt different, uneven and soft with morning dew. He walked past the gate, his pace steady, leaving the safety of his home behind. The fog clung to his skin, cold and biting, but he did not slow down. He was a traveler on a path that had no map but his own resolve. By the third day, the mountain had stripped away the illusion of a simple hike. The path was no longer dirt and grass, but a jagged spine of sharp shale that tore at his boots. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his soles as the leather shredded, exposing his skin to the biting cold of the high altitude. Leo stopped to inspect the damage, his fingers trembling as he touched the raw, exposed fabric. He reached for his canteen, expecting the familiar weight of water, but the container was hollow. He tipped it back, shaking it, but only a single, metallic drop hit his tongue. The silence of the peaks was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. He looked up at the incline ahead, his lungs burning with every thin, icy breath. His muscles felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, yet he forced himself to move. He was miles from the valley, miles from the warehouse, and entirely alone. The reality of his situation settled in as the sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting long, jagged shadows across the rocks. He was not just climbing a mountain anymore. He was fighting to keep his body moving forward. He leaned against the boulder, his breath hitching in his chest, and felt the first true bite of desperation. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a deep sickly purple before the heavens opened. Rain hit the mountain like gravel, stinging his face and turning the path into a slick, churning river of mud. Leo lunged for a protruding root, his fingers clawing at the wet earth as the ground beneath him gave way. He slid 10 feet down the slope, his legs thrashing, until he slammed into a jagged outcrop. He gasped, the air knocked from his lungs, and scrambled to find his bearings. He reached into his pocket for the compass, his hands shaking violently from the drop in temperature. The metal was slick with mud. He tried to grip it, but his fingers were numb, unresponsive. The device slipped from his grasp, clattering against the stone, before sliding silently into the black abyss below. He froze. The sound of the storm roared in his ears, but the silence inside his head was louder. He reached out, blindly sweeping his hands across the mud, but there was nothing. Panic surged, a cold, sharp clawing at his throat. The panic was a physical weight, pressing his chest against the cold stone. Leo curled into a ball, his knees pulled tight to his chin, trying to minimize the space he occupied under the narrow rock overhang. Outside, the wind howled, tearing at the mountain face, but he forced his eyes shut. He needed to stop the shaking. He focused on the sensation of the rock against his back, hard and unmoving. 1 breath in, 4 seconds. 1 breath out, 4 seconds. He repeated the count, his teeth chattering. But his mind began to settle. The terror was still there, a sharp edge in the dark, but he refused to let it dictate his movements. He pressed his palms into the mud, feeling the grit under his nails, grounding himself in the present moment. He was not a victim of the mountain. He was a man waiting for the light. Every inhale brought a tiny measure of warmth back to his lungs. He stopped thinking about the lost compass, the missing path, or the valley he had left behind. There was only the rhythm of his own heart and the slow, steady passage of time. He stayed like that for hours, until the pulse in his throat finally slowed. He had survived the night. The sun broke over the ridge, turning the frost on the rocks into a blinding, jagged mosaic. Leo crawled out from the overhang, his muscles screaming with every movement. He stood, swaying, and looked up. The final stretch was a vertical wall of loose shale that threatened to slide away with every step. He didn't look back at the valley. He locked his gaze on the horizon and climbed, digging his fingers into cracks, pulling his weight up until his lungs burned like fire. He crested the final ledge, expecting the sight of a hidden cache or a legendary hoard. He stopped. The summit was a flat, desolate plateau. There was no gold. There were no jewels. In the center of the stone basin sat a pool of water, perfectly still, acting as a flawless mirror to the vast, empty sky above. He walked to the edge, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The silence was absolute. He knelt at the water's edge, his breath hitching as he looked down. He expected to see a conqueror, but the water showed him a stranger. Leo leaned closer, his nose inches from the glass-like surface. The man in the water stared back, eyes hard and clear, stripped of the hesitation that had defined his life in the warehouse. He traced a jagged scratch across his cheekbone, a souvenir from the shale slopes. This was the cost of the climb, and it was a price he paid willingly. The fear of the warehouse, that dull, suffocating routine his father had called safety, suddenly seemed like a ghost from a different lifetime. He realized then that the mountain had not been an obstacle to overcome, but a filter. It had burned away the layers of doubt, leaving behind only the core of his own resolve. He was not a man who needed a pension plan to justify his existence. He was a man who knew exactly what he was capable of when the world tried to break him. The treasure was not hidden in the peaks. It was the resilience he had forged in the dark. He stood up, his joints popping, and looked out over the vast, silent horizon. The valley below looked small, manageable, and entirely different than it had 7 days ago. He had gone looking for a myth and found his own spine instead. The boy who feared the warehouse was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the weight of his own potential. Leo turned his back on the mirror-like pool. The descent was steep, but his footing was sure. He moved with a rhythm he had never possessed before, his weight shifting naturally against the slope. Every step down was a deliberate choice, a rejection of the life he had almost settled for. He thought of the warehouse, the gray walls, and the suffocating comfort of a steady paycheck. It felt like a dream he had woken up from, a life that belonged to someone else. He reached the lower tree line as the shadows lengthened. He was no longer the boy who needed a map. He had found the only thing that mattered, the knowledge of his own capacity. The real risk was never the mountain. It was the quiet, slow death of settling. The mountain had taught him that comfort is a cage. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Do not ignore your own calling. The world is waiting for the person you are capable of becoming. Start your journey today.